Welcome to Ampersand, the podcast helping good people be heard and comms people be better. Thanks for joining us today. I think that folks will notice you are in a car moving, but we do what we can when we have busy schedules. The icebreaker question that we like to use is about sharing a memory from your first computer or your early days on the internet. Do you have something you might want to share?
Oh boy, I think what's a really embarrassing one? Probably like downloading Dave Matthews live shows and then burning them onto CDs and like copying those CDs into like a pretty hand labeled things for like boys I had crushes on, you know, that had like sad love songs. Like, yeah, I feel like that's embarrassing enough.
That's
That was
very
like the, you know, late 90s. Yeah.
That's very adorable and definitely shows that we are similarly aged. I also did cassette tapes for a little while when you would record them off the radio.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That was the best.
Yeah. I know, it's super fun. And my kids look at me like I have like 17 heads when I talk about the good old days.
Yeah.
Changing speeds a bit. Can you share your experiences a bit with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what that's meant for you and your work?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, I am German Jewish on my mom's side and Cree and Ojibwe on my dad's. That really, I grew up in Toronto and have not had a lot of community and certainly have not had any access to ceremony. And it was really through the TRC that I began to kind of understand my own inheritance through a more complex lens. You know, up until then, it had been like internalized, you know, discomfort with my grandfather and not knowing how to navigate that relationship, and sort of finding discomfort too in my dad's silence, like his inability to talk about his own childhood and his own relationship with his own indigeneity. And then it was really during the TRC, you know, and I think Connie Walker's reporting definitely shaped some of how I was hearing, you know, that news, because I think she was really the first mainstream reporter that I was exposed to who was no longer reporting through a colonized or racist lens. And so it really opened my eyes to understand my own inheritance and motivated me to like personally take more responsibility for the choices I was making and the choices I wanted to make in my own future.
That's really interesting. You know, you and I have never talked about this, so I'm kind of fascinated to hear about sort of your side of these things, right? You know, obviously in your view, publishing has a big role to play in this, but I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to the legacy of the TRC and how that might have influenced the publishing industry.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, publishing is one of the sectors that I think has really taken some of the calls to action quite seriously, and has really put significant resources behind attempting to decolonize and indigenize its spaces. You know, some with greater success than others. I think you can measure the difference between Indigenous representation on the West Coast versus the East. We now have, you know, a significant roster of incredibly talented Indigenous writers getting published in Canada, and some in the US, but it's not as significant as it is in Canada, which wouldn't have happened 15 years ago. You know, when I was first entering the industry, even like looking for Indigenous writers who wanted to be published was proving to be hard. And now it feels like there's, you know, this incredible long list of people who are getting published really successfully. And, you know, I think the challenge now is finding more Indigenous representation in the industry itself, you know, Indigenous editors, Indigenous publishers, Indigenous designers, you know, people who can help to sort of broaden the perspective in those spaces as well.
Yeah, and I know you're too humble to say you're playing a role in that, but obviously you and your publisher are doing a lot around this work. I mean, it's encouraging to hear that, you know, things are changing, but when we look at how many calls to actions are not yet complete, you know, it's always nice to hear something positive because a lot of the podcasts we've done so far are sort of around the lack of progress. What do you think? What role do you think media and journalism and publishing play in this? Because, you know, you have a public face.
Mm-hmm. I think media and journalism need to do a lot more. The publishing books is, one part of it, but the reality is there's very little space in the media for books. So even though, we are, trying to publish different stories and different lived experiences and even different languages, if we're not getting media attention on those books, it's really hard to get the visibility that we need. So I think that there's a few different missed media opportunities. I mean, one is for like the swell of Indigenous narratives happening, the swell of Indigenous talent, and then also for like what isn't happening, and the responsibility that we all have to take in terms of trying to make sure that we do something about that. And that I'm waiting for that coverage, and I'm hoping that there's some attention drawn to that this year in terms of accountability for what hasn't yet happened with those calls to action. My dad actually runs this organization called Indigenous Watchdog that is just that. Like, it is a task list of holding the government accountable to the calls to action, and a constant report in real time about what's happening or isn't happening, to make sure that there is progress being made.
Neat. Just within government or all of the calls?
All of the calls.
Okay, cool. We'll have to look that up. You mentioned storytelling, and obviously Indigenous storytelling has a role to play. Do you want to touch a bit on sort of how and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's my personal answer, and then there's my professional answer. Personally, I think it's, I never saw myself reflected in books in any way. My inheritance is complicated. I'm obviously Indigenous on my dad's side and German Jewish on my mom's. And I saw a lot of our, Jewish inheritance and Holocaust stories that it was taught, it was discussed, it was acknowledged. And on my dad's side, I think and really believe, that a part of why my grandfather wasn't able to heal, a part of why it took my father well into his 60s to heal, is because that reality, the truth of the history that people have had to live here in Canada, has not been a part of the public discourse until quite recently. So, now that the truth of people's experiences, which have been told through testimony and through storytelling, that is in itself a form of healing. And in that healing, then there is space for reconciliation. But that, can't happen without truth. And the storytelling, I think, is essential to providing that truth. And there's many different entry points to it, and that's where I think that books and traditional publishing actually have a significant responsibility to play, because it can be through a novel. It's not just straight nonfiction that interrogates the different realities over time and rewrites Canadian history. I think that that's important too. But then for people who need a softer entry point, falling in love with a care and understanding their lived experience is still an education, and it's still one to understand and come to terms with true Canadian history. So I guess I merged my personal and professional answers.
I was going to say, which one was personal and which was professional?
Yeah. So, I mean, on the professional side, I can take it a step further, because it does feel like I take the responsibility of publishing Indigenous storytellers very seriously. And it's not just a question of buying a book and then publishing it, or editing a book and then publishing it. It's, you've got to edit these stories differently. You've got to publish them differently. You've got to ask hard questions and advocate in spaces that are not built to accommodate Indigenous voices. So I do feel like a lot of my energy goes into that, and will continue to for the duration of my career. And I think that there'll be, small inches of progress, but I think it'll take a while before we actually see these things embedded in our systems.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you can see a shift in the last 10 years, but obviously that's only a minute amount of time. One of the things that we've talked about a lot, and I think is concerning, is around the rise of denialism and disinformation around residential schools. Do you think publishing and storytelling can push back against that? Is there a role that the publishing industry could play on that?
I think it is, to a certain extent. There have been a couple of books published in the last year that really directly try to address denialism. The challenge is, I don't think that the people who are actively denialists are ever going to read those books. I think that they are staying within their own echo chambers, and they're not willing to step outside of it to attempt to learn. And if they had, then they would see quite clearly that there's no wiggle room around this truth. So I think that we can advocate for those stories, and we can try to put them in spaces where they might be exposed to the people who are more likely to, not advocate or to be explicit denialists. I just don't know that we're able to permeate it. And that's, I think, generally my deepest worry, is that now we are so divided in terms of our culture that we're all operating within our own echo chambers, unable to, hear what the discourse is on the other side.
Yeah, I share that deep concern as well. Rage farming is a term I saw recently, and I'm just like, that's totally what's happening, and I hate it, but I don't also know how to push back against it in a constructive way, because the internet, while it also gives us all sorts of good things, has also allowed, this division to happen. Is there a call to action from the TRC that needs more attention in the publishing world? Is there something you wish other folks would be focusing on as well as you?
I'm always focused on education. I think that that's also where, from my professional post and within my own professional capacity, I have the most influence. And I try to sort of stay focused to manage my own personal anxiety about where I can move the needle a little bit, because otherwise it's overwhelming. But in terms of education, publishing historically has played a really significant role in shaping the conversations that are happening in the classroom. And now I'm really working very hard to try to rebuild that network, so that we can make sure that Indigenous texts are being taught not just in the Indigenous mandated classes, but across the board, and that comes down to many, many different choices, including the new classic series that I'm starting from McClelland Stewart, which is half Indigenous, half non-Indigenous titles that were kind of traditionally neglected, or published at a time or into a space that didn't give them the honor of the timeless, excellent work that they are, and certainly haven't been published with the frame that would help teachers understand how to teach them. And so I'm really working very, very hard in that space in particular, because I think that if we can shape children's understanding of what it means to be Indigenous in this country and what Indigenous history means in this country, then they're more likely to grow up and be more active and compassionate to what the Indigenous reality currently is, and to push back against some of the more pervasive problems that we're seeing.
Yeah, as we know, Murray always said education got us into this mess and it will get us out. And I can see the shift even with my own kids who are in elementary and middle school. They're learning it now. They didn't when I first started in their world. I'm the stepmom, and that wasn't in the curriculum 10 years ago, and now it is. It's going to be a slow burn to get it into everywhere for everyone. But, they go to a French Catholic school and they are learning about, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in a fairly respectful way. It probably could be better, but.
Yep. Well, that's where we come in, Hopefully we can help provide the resources and the books that will, make them even more respectful.
Yeah. Can the publishing industry support and uplift Indigenous voices more effectively? Do you think there are specific ways that it could be improved?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think that there's a lot of publishing of Indigenous stories right now, but I don't know that a lot of those stories are reaching the communities they're in fact written for. So we haven't yet built the infrastructure to do that. So that's a major thing. And then the academic network is another major thing. And finding spaces to lead conversations and discourse despite a lack of traditional media that is now no longer focused on books are the three things that weigh on me.
Yeah, my kids have Kindles and are continuing to read, but they're reading less and they definitely go on their phones a lot more. So finding different formats and ways to get it in front of them is obviously key. We're 10 years out from the TRC. Where do you hope we will be in another 10? If we were to talk in 10 years, what's changed?
Indigenous representation in the classroom and more Indigenous representation in publishing offices. Right now it feels like the way that, some of the stats around like the number of Indigenous people who are incarcerated, the number of Indigenous kids in foster care is astronomical relative to our percentage of the population. And it's also like flatlined relative to our contributions to the population in terms of jobs, and opportunities within the industry. So, trying to think about how we can reduce barriers to entry. There's no reason why publishing should be operating behind an opaque curtain. It's like, it's interesting, but it's not mysterious or magical. There's, it's like uncalled for, so to try to like be more actively involved in recruiting new talent. I think that's possible in the next 10 years. I think infiltrating the classroom is possible in the next 10 years. And like the geographic challenges, now that audio is such a successful form, I think that we can also like do more in that space to make sure that communities that are hard to reach have access.
Oh, I like that idea. I haven't thought that through. And you're right, like the podcast format, audiobooks, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that there's too many people entering these conversations thinking that it's an us versus them, or feeling some sort of shame and embarrassment, or feeling too afraid to ask questions. I in my mind, all I can really say is like, I'm still asking a ton of questions. I'm still learning a ton. I think to be engaged is to be contributing and to be like helpful in terms of helping all of us find a path forward together. And so I hope that more of us can be brave, be brave to make mistakes, be brave to, not sound like you know what you're doing. I don't know what I'm doing, and we can, chart along that path together.
I love that. Yeah, it is definitely reconciliation. I don't know why I can't say my words today. Requires all of us, and that's one of the things that I definitely have learned through this work is that you will make mistakes, but that's okay, and you just try your best and learn and be humble. And sometimes that's hard to do, but you've got to. So it's going to be a long walk that we have to take together.
Yeah, exactly. And to like, we can be kind to one another while we're doing that, and that there's no us versus them, that we all live here. And especially right now, like while things are precarious, that we need to work together. So, like we just need to find a way to learn to try to begin to build trust. Yeah.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Ampersand. Thanks for joining us. For more comms and design tips, sign up for our newsletter at m-agency.ca and follow us on your favorite podcasting app so that you don't miss our next episode. Ampersand is hosted by me, Caitlin Kealey, and it's produced by Elio Peterson. This podcast is a project of M-, the small agency focused on big impact helping progressives be heard.